Hello, everyone, and welcome back to yet another edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. Another week, another string of great shows for you guys. My name, as always, is Christopher Shepard. Thank you guys yet again for tuning in. And this week should be a very interesting week of shows. We have a special July 4th segment for an upcoming show. We have so many good player profiles still remaining, and we also have some Euros fantasy to talk about, and also some trade talks and their fantasy implications in the NBA as well. And so this week is going to start off with a bang. We have a lot of great segments, including some Euros, including some basketball, and of course those coveted player profiles you guys seem to love a lot. But before we begin with any of that, as always, I do ask that you like, follow, and subscribe to the show. We also do receive a lot of tips and donations, so if you do feel so inclined, please consider leaving them at the link gsmc.cloud. It is a huge support to both me, my fellow podcasters, and ultimately the network as a whole, so anything you leave is greatly appreciated. You can also leave questions, comments, concerns from prior episodes, or even from today's segments as well, and they will be answered at the beginning of the next episode. But without further ado, let us jump right into the show, and we will start off, like I said, with the aforementioned Euros. We had a couple of round of 16 games going on, and they set up some really interesting quarterfinal matches. We will get to that later in the week, but for now, we're going to review the events of the weekend's round of 16 games, and of course, the fantasy stars. Now, we had a lot of interesting games with a lot of interesting players within them. But let's start off with a very thunderous start to the round of 16, quite literally, between Germany and Denmark. This game certainly felt like it could be a trap game for Germany, because Denmark is a very compact team. They have a very tall defense. They, while not necessarily creating much, can really confound you with their ability to have such an industrious work rate off the ball. And for large parts of this game, Germany did look a little bit frustrated, but ultimately they came out 2-0 winners. Maybe that thunder interval really helped them a little bit calm themselves down, maintain their focus, and get that win. But definitely could have gone a different way, but ultimately it sees Germany into the quarterfinal, and it sets up a mouth-watering clash with Spain, which, like I said before, we'll talk about later in the week. But for now, let's focus on the stars of that game, starting off with perhaps the star of the tournament so far, Jamal Musiala. What more can we say about this young man that hasn't been said before? This is perhaps him in his best ever form internationally on a team that fully now has an identity and is truly confident that they can get past anyone at this moment. And he is the centerpiece of all that. 3 goals on 7 attempts this tournament, 92% pass accuracy, 28 successful dribbles. Now, against Spain, his mettle is definitely going to be proven, because Spain has been tough to break down. They look very solid defensively, only conceding an own goal throughout the entire tournament. So Jamal Musiala will have to prove himself yet again at this international stage in this clash. But for now, he is certainly looking like one of the more electrifying players at this tournament for any team. No, every team wants a Jamal Musiala on it because he is such a dynamo, whether it be picking up the ball from deep, running into the box, laying it off for his fellow players, or just, offering that space that opens up so much opportunities for Germany's other creative players. Jamal Musiala is an incredible asset, especially if you're looking for a player who can make a deep run in the tournament for your Euros fantasy squad. And then on the back end of things, there were a lot of things to like for Germany. Their defense looked very solid in this game. Yes, it could have been a lot worse had that Joachim Andersen goal stood. But I do believe that the German defense had a lot of good takeaways from it. I could have picked any player from this Germany defense and been very happy about it. Antonio Rudiger was obviously the man of the match. Nico Schlotterbeck stepping in for the suspended Jonathan Tah. Fantastic defensive performance from him. And also David Raum stepping in for Maxi Mittelstadt. And Joshua Kimmich remaining semi-solid at right back. I know he's playing out of position, but he's still there. But Manuel Neuer, in my mind, captured the headlines. He's actually not been asked to do that much for Germany because Germany have been solid defensively around him, and he hasn't faced as many shots as we expected. But when he is called into action, he's proven that any criticism he faced earlier in the tournament has been dispelled. He's had 7 saves, 2 clean sheets, and 5 claims throughout this tournament. So he definitely is going to have a much larger role in the Spain game, because I think Spain will also be on the attack quite often in this game. The possession battle will be even, and Manuel Neuer will be called upon because of the fact that Spain is so pacey on the wings. I don't know if Germany can deal with that. So Manuel Neuer, look for him, especially in the next game, and especially if Germany do progress, to be one of the central players in this Germany squad that you might want to rely upon moving forward. That will just about do it for Germany. Let's switch to the most impressive team in the round of 16, in my humble opinion, Switzerland, beating the defending champions Italy by the same scoreline, 2-0. And one of the players from Switzerland truly impressing this tournament, highly underrated midfielder, internationally as well as domestically as well, Ruben Vargas. Fantastic goal. Might be the goal of the tournament so far against Italy. He has a 1 goal, 1 assist, 79.75% pass accuracy with 5 attempts. And I just think that in a weaker side of the bracket, if you're looking for someone in your US fantasy team who will definitely have an easy chance, obviously England look vulnerable, and that is who Switzerland is playing next. Why not take a flyer on a guy like Ruben Vargas, who you can certainly trust will be bossing the Switzerland midfield. Obviously, Switzerland definitely does have a very intriguing midfield with guys like Granit Xhaka. You have a guy like Xherdan Shaqiri, who kind of plays as a 10, kind of plays on the wing. But Ruben Vargas definitely seems like the center of it. Him and also Remo Freuler, who I can't forget, scoring the goals, and kind of leading this revolutionized Swiss midfield. I think it's going to be a much more difficult game for England than people realize. Definitely perhaps the most difficult of the tournament because of the dynamic Swiss midfield that's equal part experienced and equal parts youthful. So Ruben Vargas is definitely one to watch. Now, unfortunately, we do have to switch to England. They still haven't kicked into gear. That's all I'm going to say about them. But if there is one player who certainly proved that big-time players make big-time plays, it's the young man named after the Beatles song, Jude Bellingham, scoring a beautiful bicycle kick in the dying moments of their game against Slovakia to send it to extra time where they ultimately would win 2-1. But Jude Bellingham has come under heavy criticism in this tournament, but looking at the stats here, he certainly seems as if he is playing like the best player England has right now, and he's definitely proving it. He has 2 goals, the most on this team, tied with Harry Kane, 88.75% pass accuracy on 3 attempts, 11 dribbles. So I just feel like Jude Bellingham, if he's allowed to play the number 10 position freely, it truly unlocks a lot more in this England squad. If Jude Bellingham can just be Jude Bellingham and not have any other players conflicting with his space and looking so disorganized, Jude Bellingham can certainly help England get very far and play some attractive football whilst doing it. It doesn't have to be a turgid affair every single game for this English side, and they're making it that way. But if I'm Gareth Southgate, I'm just letting Jude be Jude. I think that Jude Bellingham just needs the space to operate, and when he does, good things will happen for England. And that's all I'll say about that. Now let's move on to kind of the mismatch of the round of 16 between Spain and Georgia. Ultimately, it was kind of a shock that Georgia took an early lead in this game, but ultimately everyone knew that Spain would come back because they just have so much firepower, and it's truly a joy to watch, especially these young forwards. But before we get into one of those young dynamic forwards, I do want to offer my congratulations to Georgia for lighting up the tournament. Their fans, their supporters were fantastic yesterday. Every single time Georgia was on the counter, the roar from the crowd was deafening and incredible to listen to. So kudos to Georgia for making this tournament what it was. And ultimately, kudos to the young man in net who had one of the most fantastically dominant goalkeeping performances of the tournament, especially in a team that relied so heavily upon him, in Yorhi Mamardashvili. His stock is definitely rising. He's not going to be a Valencia player much longer after this performance. 31 saves in 4 games for a Georgian team whose defense is leaky to say the least, but just them trusting that he will stop everything in his path, especially long-range shots. He was fantastic on those. Georgi Mamardashvili, whether you rostered him or not, is such a feel-good story in this Euros, and someone who will definitely have a very bright future, both internationally and domestically. The sky's the limit for him, and I just wanted to acknowledge at least one Georgia player after that game, because they definitely fought their hearts out, and ultimately they just lost to a far superior team. And let's talk about this far superior team in Spain. Definitely looking like the scariest team in the tournament right now, especially because of the fact that gone is the tiki-taka era, and now you have these 2 dynamic young wingers in Nico Williams and a guy I want to talk about, Lamine Yamal, who just add that dynamism and pace and electricity and fire on the wings. Now, Lamine Yamal, youngest player of the tournament, youngest player to feature in a knockout phase of the tournament, youngest player since Cristiano Ronaldo in 2004 to register the most assists in this tournament with 2 on 11 attempts. He has a 79.75% pass accuracy and 21 dribbles. He is asked to do a lot for the Spanish side. The big question is, can he maintain this at such a young age, or will he fall flat when facing a better team? We'll see against Germany. But right now, Lamine Yamal and Yamal Musiala, that is going to be a mouth-watering clash. And if you're a fantasy manager, you are chomping at the bit to get one of these guys on your team, because they are truly the cream of the crop in this tournament. But that will just about do it for this segment of today's show. Hope you guys enjoyed this Euros weekend. Keep on watching the Euros round of 16 until the quarterfinals start on Friday with that Germany-Spain game. But coming up next, we'll be looking at the 2024 NBA rookie draft class in terms of fantasy implications. Who, if anyone, from this rookie draft class can step up and be a contributor in terms of fantasy? You will have to see. We will be right back with that segment.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in...
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you, as always, by the GSMC Sports Network. Thank you guys for tuning in again. I hope you enjoyed that Euros weekend recap. But coming up next, we should have a very interesting, controversial kind of segment talking about the 2024 NBA rookie draft class in terms of their fantasy implications. But before we get into that, I wanted to remind you guys just yet again to, if you do feel so inclined, consider leaving a tip or donation at the link gsmc.cloud. It is a huge support to both me, my fellow podcasters, and ultimately the network. Anything you leave is greatly appreciated. Without further ado, we're going to stay on the screen to kind of dissect this rookie draft class, because it truly is an intriguing one. Now, the one thing that really makes this rookie draft class very interesting is that it definitely isn't top heavy, and there definitely is not that superstar personality we often see in a draft class. Now, that's not to say that any of these guys can't be superstars with their respective teams. I just feel that this feels like a very developmental draft. A lot of these players are kind of projects, not necessarily full, well-rounded players that you can rely upon in the rookie seasons to have huge minutes, get a lot of playing time. And ultimately, it's kind of reflective of how the league is developing, you know? A lot more of these younger teams, lottery teams, are trying to rely on the core they've already built through past years in the draft, especially lottery teams. And so, as a result, you're seeing kind of this reliance on flyers, you know? Not necessarily full-rounded players. Guys who are a little rough around the edges that can truly kind of help these young cores become a well-rounded unit. And so, a lot of these guys who I'm going to mention are truly rugged, in my honest opinion. Rugged is what the word I think of when I'm describing these players. They're not necessarily the best, but they can be assets, especially in fantasy. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. Starting off with our number 1 overall pick in Zachary Rezaker of France, going to the Atlanta Hawks, who now look like they could have Rezaker as a nice little versatile option due to the Dejounte Murray trade. Obviously, they do have a lot of role players who might want to step up. Guys like DeAndre Hunter, Cam Reddish, Jalen Johnson could get a lot more minutes. And they still obviously have Trae Young. But Zachary Rezaker definitely can be an intriguing option. He's at great length, 6'9", 10, 3-and-D wing. Obviously, there's a little bit of worry concerning his strength and abilities off the ball in terms of shot creation. But ultimately, I truly believe that Zachary Rezaker, now that Dejounte Murray is gone, can be kind of a second option. He's going to need to be, actually, because the Atlanta Hawks need to take some pressure off of Trae Young, and they should view Rezaker as an option to do that because of his length and versatility. Now, ultimately, in terms of figuring out and gauging his fantasy stock, I don't necessarily think he's going to go above pick 100. I think that many of these rookies in this class are probably going to go in very late rounds or even go undrafted in many fantasy drafts. But Zachary Rezaker certainly has the most upside. I think he could be drafted a little bit earlier than that, maybe overvalued a little bit due to the fact that he's on a Hawks team that now needs that second option. But if there's any silver lining, it's that Rezaker definitely has the mentality to do it. He is fantastic in terms of his dunking abilities, his presence around the rim, and so I'm really looking to see if he can be a guy who steps into that Hawks roster and goes, I'm willing to offer you guys something at either the power forward or center position or even the small forward position that you haven't had before. I'm willing to be fantastic in pick and rolls. I'm willing to both play on the offensive side of the ball and defensive side of the ball. Ultimately, I can be the guy that truly supports Trae Young now that Dejounte Murray is gone. So that's why Zachary Rezaker is certainly one of the safer bets if I were to pick anyone from this draft class to go on fantasy drafts. I think it would be him. Now, moving on to the second pick, Alex Sarr going to the Wizards. Now, whereas the Hawks have truly their star in place in Trae Young, the Wizards really don't. They traded away a guy who they were really high on, Deni Avdija. I don't necessarily see how this Wizards team is going to compete anytime soon. Probably going to be one of the worst teams in the league. But Alex Sarr, I think, is a project kind of guy who they're going to focus on and develop over the next couple of years. And potentially, he will be the face of that franchise. He definitely has mobility and size, definitely like Rezaker. I think he's a very solid passer. He definitely has a lot of upside in terms of volume, especially in terms of his abilities, both scoring and rebounding. He's a double-double machine. But much like Zachary Rezaker, I can't really find a solid placement for him in fantasy drafts. maybe a 6th round flyer is kind of what I see in Alex Sarr. However, I certainly think that this was potentially a steal for the Wizards because a lot of people are saying that Alex Sarr should and could have gone number 1. And so we'll see how Sarr pans out in a much more difficult environment than, say, Atlanta. But for now, I feel that Alex Sarr can definitely rival Razaka in terms of his volume and level of play as a rookie as well. Let's move on to another fascinating big man, in Donovan Clingan, perhaps the best defensive big man and best college big man in this draft in terms of just his size, his verticality. Just seeing him play in the Big East, I'm a huge fan of Big East basketball. Just seeing him play goes to show that the center position is evolving because Donovan Clingan is a very interestingly built man. I think that all of his power derives from his upper half. He can really get up and block the ball. I think that he's a plus rebounder and defender who, within this draft, really offers that perfect blend of strength and physicality that perhaps Razaka and Sarr don't have and could lead to Clingan's benefit. He's on a Portland team that ultimately will probably rely on DeAndre Ayton a lot more than him, but I still see him getting at least 12 to 15 minutes a game. I think that he might be a non-starter, but ultimately I think taking a flyer on him or even streaming him in fantasy basketball could be an option for you because of his intriguing size and the way he uses it. But moving on next, let's switch over to a shooter, shall we? A pure shooter. And move away from the big men, the trees and the paint. And Reed Sheppard. Reed Sheppard out of Kentucky. Best shooter probably in this draft class. Shot 52% behind the arc. I think he's going to have a very high usage rate. He's on a Rockets team that's definitely trying to turn into something, especially wanting to be one of these young teams on the rise in the Western Conference as it gets more crowded. And Reed Sheppard definitely offers something highly intriguing. There's a lot of young athleticism on this Houston Rockets offense. You have a guy like Jalen Green who uses his height and length to go up and make plays around the rim. Ultimately, he's also seen as a rim protector on the defensive end. You have a guy in Alperen Şengün who's not a typical big man, kind of a flashier big man in the mold of a Nikola Jokic. And then you bring in a guy like Sheppard who can shoot the lights out. And so I really think that Reed Sheppard is definitely my dark horse in terms of fantasy in this particular draft class. Because A, the Houston Rockets are starting to find more balance in their squad. And B, shooters should be much more highly valued than a rookie big man. Because rookie big men are, in my humble opinion, a very risky addition to any team. Because the big men in this league are becoming much more polished, and as a rookie, I kind of feel like there's a lot of pressure to kind of overperform, and so you might come out into the league and not really live up to people's expectations due to the fact that the big man position is evolving. But for now, switching back to Sheppard and his abilities on the ball, I truly think that there's a lot of upside to taking someone like him, especially should the Rockets view him as a starter and they rely on him to get their three-point production. I think that Houston haven't had this good a shooter since James Harden, and I really believe that his upside tremendously outweighs that of, say, a rookie big man who might struggle in this league, especially as they transition to facing big men like Nikola Jokic and Karl Anthony Towns and Rudy Gobert and Anthony Davis. Reed Sheppard, the pressure will be off him. But last but not least, let's kind of go to another big man, Tijani Saloun, one of the youngest draftees, also from France, this French Revolution coming into the league right now. Another guy, like I said, offers that length, offers the 3-and-D, that size versatility on the Charlotte Hornets. Ultimately, I think they want to become more of an inside-outside team, not rely on LaMelo Ball that much. Kind of utilize him more in the pick-and-roll game. So, Salayoun, I still think he's going to be a non-starter. Perhaps a couple minutes are in his future, but I think that this guy is more of a down-the-road fantasy option. I don't think he's a here-and-now fantasy option. Give him time to develop, and over the next 3 to 5 years, as he starts to get more rotations, more minutes, I think that Dejounte Salayoun will round into form. But that will just about do it for this diagnosis of this 2024 NBA rookie draft class. Coming up next, we have another basketball segment for you guys. Dejounte Murray, as I alluded to kind of in this segment, got traded to the New Orleans Pelicans. What are the fantasy implications for both the Atlanta Hawks and New Orleans Pelicans as they head into this season with new look teams? We will be right back to discuss that.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. I hope you guys liked that basketball segment because we are sticking in the basketball world and discussing a potential trade, actually a real-time trade that already happened and its ensuing fantasy implications for both teams involved. Yes, I'm talking about the Dejounte Murray trade, kind of the first big trade of this window. We see Dejounte Murray, an exciting young guard, moving to a New Orleans Pelicans team that wants to kind of find that balance between guys like Zion and Brandon Ingram and guys like CJ McCollum and now Dejounte Murray. And so I kind of feel like this trade certainly swings the pendulum in favor of the Pelicans in terms of who won it, just because of the sheer amount of abilities that Dejounte Murray can bring to this. I think he's a fantastic defensive asset. I think he adds the length at the shooting guard position should he be the starter by the start of the season. He's kind of a 3-and-D type player. He adds balance already to CJ McCollum should the Pelicans organization view him as a second option off the bench, but I don't think that will be the case. I think that ultimately what Dejounte Murray can also bring is he can create a lot of looks for Zion inside, so he's not necessarily having to create for himself in isolation. And also, in terms of Brandon Ingram, I think that Ingram will still be able to offer his similar kind of level of production as he goes on as well. But looking at this trade, the New Orleans Pelicans for the past couple of years have always been a weird team, especially with the goings-on of a player like Zion Williamson. Because when he's healthy, he certainly is very electric, very dynamic in the way he plays. He's very aggressive and powerful at the point of attack. I really think that there's tremendous upside should Zion continue to play and be fully fit. But I just feel like he needed someone who allows him to just stay healthy. I think that Zion kind of pushes himself a little bit too much, and as a result, the wear and tear on his much larger body and larger physique ultimately wears him down a lot and thus leads to more injury. But now with the addition of Dejounte Murray, he doesn't necessarily have to create as much for this offense. He can just occupy the paint, maybe work the pick and roll game, and have Dejounte Murray kind of be that distributor of the ball that the Pelicans so desperately needed. And ultimately, I kind of feel like Zion, as a power forward, doesn't necessarily have to space the floor as much for the Pelicans. Dejounte Murray will be tasked with that. In terms of guys like Ingram and McCollum who have a similar profile to Dejounte Murray, I think they'll be just fine. I think that Brandon Ingram, he's an incredible shot creator. So is CJ McCollum. He is also a fantastic distributor of the ball. Maybe not the best defender on this team, but that's certainly what Dejounte Murray can help out with if they should they play together. But right now, I kind of feel like the Pelicans can certainly vault themselves into contention in the crowded West. Obviously, we're going to have to see this team on the court to see if everything gels, because on paper it looks fantastic, but everything just needs to come together for this Pelicans team in order for me to truly invest in terms of fantasy on them as well. But I certainly feel that each and every single one of these Pelicans players can offer something different to you in terms of fantasy. Dejounte Murray, one of the only two players in the league last year with 1,500 points, 500 assists, and 100 steals outside of Nikola Jokic, so that's fantastic company for him. So he can be seen as a huge asset in terms of fantasy for you guys. And also, Zion, I think that his production in terms of points and rebounds will elevate. And Ingram and McCollum shouldn't necessarily panic as much. And you shouldn't necessarily panic as a fantasy manager in terms of deciding to pick them. Now, what does this do for the other team in this trade? The Atlanta Hawks. Obviously, you never want to lose a guy like Dejounte Murray, especially when you're building a nice little duopoly with him and Trae Young. But I kind of feel like it was going to happen, especially due to the fact that they got that number one pick in the lottery, selected Zachary Razakar, and kind of look like they're going in a different direction where they're not necessarily building through their guard play, but might be building through their big men. But I certainly feel like it doesn't necessarily impact Trae Young negatively just yet. I think he certainly gets more volume. What I'm kind of worried about, however, is the risk for injury here, because no matter how prolific Trae Young is, I feel that he definitely gets overworked in this offense. Last year we saw Dejounte Murray kind of elevate his game to help Trae Young out, but when Trae Young is alone, he can't do everything by himself. He kind of reminds me of a player like Jalen Brunson, where he has to play every minute in order for his team to compete, and they look drastically different when he is off the court. And so, adding that level of volume might be a bit risky, but he definitely will get much more production out of it, and he certainly could be a top fantasy point guard yet again as a fantasy manager. So, looking for him to be that centerpiece of the Atlanta Hawks rebuild could bode well, but it also could be an ominous sign of the decline of Trae Young should he feel overwhelmed by the level of production he receives. But with that being said, I certainly think Razakar, no matter how much criticism will come over him, definitely not the strongest number one pick in recent memory, but he definitely adds a lot of upside. I think that the Hawks certainly need big men because they just have a lot of different role players and not a true identity. So they need someone to say, hey, we can have an identity outside of Trae Young, and Razakar can certainly be that guy. I think that they should kind of stick him at, say, the power forward center spot, because that might be best for him to develop, and they certainly seem as if they need that kind of infrastructure in the middle. But ultimately, I just think that Razakar just needs that development. I think that he needs to be entrusted with this idea of growth within himself, within the system. I think that transitioning from the French game to the NBA, much like what happened with Wemby, is going to be difficult, but I think he'll find his footing, because Wemby did find his footing, and now he's the cream of the league. Definitely looking to be one of the better fantasy players. And maybe that could be Razakar in 4 or 5 years, because he's not as polished as Wemby. But ultimately, both these teams right now are in drastically opposite directions. I think the New Orleans Pelicans are looking to attack this crowded Western Conference, and the Atlanta Hawks are just looking to stay in that play-in range and hopefully find some wins to vault them into the upper echelon of the Eastern Conference. But for now, I would say I'm much more confident in how the New Orleans Pelicans have built their team than the Atlanta Hawks, because this certainly feels like one of those drafts that can be very hit or miss. And if the Hawks miss on this pick, losing Dejounte Murray will hurt that much more. I think the Hawks certainly could have had more value had they traded down. There's a lot of talks about that, and gotten someone like a Donovan Clingan, who down the road could help you out just because of his physicality he brings. And, maybe he could have been the center you need to kind of balance out Trae Young and Dejounte Murray's play. But it's now in the past. It can't be reversed. And so the Atlanta Hawks are now in a conundrum where they have to rely on Razaka. And if he's a failure, then their organization in many ways has failed as well. Whereas the Pelicans were like, hey, we have just seen so many teams pass us by in the Western Conference. We don't want to get left behind, especially when Zion is still in the prime of his career. And we just need someone that can lighten his load. And so we have to scope out and swing for the fences. And with this Dejounte Murray trade, I truly feel like they have elevated themselves to one of those teams that you might in the future be betting on to win the NBA championship, or at least the Western Conference, because of the sheer abilities of each of these players. They are fantastically different player profiles, but I just feel like they can work together. I think that with Murray's defense, with Zion's rim presence, with Ingram's shot creation, and McCollum's just in industry and work rate, I feel like the Pelicans are rounding into form a little bit here. And all of those four players can be true fantasy assets to all of you if you're looking to them in terms of the draft. But that should just about do it for this segment of today's show. Coming up next, we also are going to stick with the basketball realm a little bit more and talk about some fantasy takeaways that I saw from last season in the NBA. It should be a fascinating segment. You guys don't want to miss it, as we are in the home stretch of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. We'll be right back.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere
Hello everyone, and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. I hope you are enjoying this very basketball heavy show, because we are going to stick with this topic before we get into the final segment of today's show, which is a player profile. So without further ado, let's jump into some of my fantasy takeaways from this NBA season. It was a very fascinating, to say the least, fantasy season in the NBA. A lot of different players stepping up, a lot of top level players maintaining their dominance in terms of fantasy, and that is one of the takeaways I want to start off with. Just to the sheer level of production, the top 3 or so players in terms of fantasy in the NBA have produced over the past couple of years, and they're constantly and steadily improving, and they're showing no signs of slowing. Let's start off with Nikola Jokic. I saw the potential in him many years before to be the guy he is now, just because of the way he adapts his style of play. He's continuously evolving. He's always willing to not only score points, but do the dirty work as well. Nikola Jokic averaged a career-high 60.3 ESPN fantasy points per game. And also, Joel Embiid, if he stays healthy, he definitely isn't in the MVP conversation. And then Luka Doncic as well. We saw he had an incredible run, especially in the postseason, leaving it all on the line for his Dallas Mavericks. They were the only ones over 53 points per game. So as you can see, those are the top stay at the top because they are just willing to just leave everything on the field, on the court, and just produce those numbers that they know they can. And they're definitely going to be hot commodities and going very early, if not number one overall, in fantasy draft boards. Now, another big storyline from this NBA season in terms of fantasy implications lies in the West. All of the big four players in LA stayed healthy. Now, I know that they certainly are kind of waning in terms of production, the LA Lakers. The LA Lakers are not necessarily the hottest team in the league. They're going through some turmoil. And also the Clippers, who look like early on in the year, they could contend for the title as well. But when their big four stays healthy, they are some of the better fantasy producers just due to the sheer impact that they have in all facets of the game. You know, I feel as if LeBron and AD together, now that, Paul George is now gone to the 76ers, is going to offer a lot more upside than, say, a lonely Kawhi Leonard on the Clippers. But right now, I just feel like health is all the LA teams have going for them. They don't necessarily offer any upside in terms of playoff production. They don't offer any upside in terms of excitement and appeal unless those guys are healthy. If not, then they're in really tough spots. I haven't seen a Lakers team this desperate in many years. And the LA Clippers have always been desperate. And going from looking like one of the more promising leagues to losing Paul George in free agency right now just is a terrible look for them. And it shouldn't matter in terms of fantasy, but I think it will once, LeBron leaves AD in the dust, potentially goes into retirement next year, and Kawhi Leonard's like, you know what, I have to abandon ship and from LA too and get out of here before it all comes crashing down, because while projects are good in terms of fantasy, because you have these guys, all of these guys who can offer you high upside everywhere on the court, it certainly is risky on the court as well, because you have to manage egos and it's not always pretty. And I certainly think JJ Redick will have a tough task with that, but that's outside of my realm. In terms of fantasy, the big four staying healthy was paramount, because a lot of people still like the value that LeBron James brings, and also they know that when Anthony Davis produces and is healthy, he is one of the top 3 fantasy centers, in my humble opinion, in fantasy drafts. And so I think that them maintaining their health was much more important in terms of fantasy than, say, anything going on the court. That being said, let's transition to another player who did not remain as healthy, but we saw flashes of what he could potentially be in terms of fantasy implications next year just because of his sheer abilities, and that is Joel Embiid. Joel Embiid will always struggle to stay on the court. It's not a question. Joel Embiid will always have his struggles on and off the court. But when he is on the court, he certainly can be one of the best players, not just in the Eastern Conference, but in the entire NBA. 35.3, 11.3, 5.7 stat line, but only in 34 games. And I really think that in order for Joel Embiid to have really any impact in terms of fantasy, he's got to be supplemented with the teammates around him that he knows he needs, and adding Paul George certainly can add to that. There's a lot less pressure on him. And B, I just feel that Joel Embiid needs to stop pushing it so hard. He needs to stop trying to overachieve, because in all reality, you don't need that much from Joel Embiid. You just need the presence he brings. His presence alone truly confounds opposing NBA defenses, and so Joel Embiid just needs to remain calm and focused on the task at hand, and that is A, maintaining himself, and B, trying to break through in the process. And so I definitely feel like if you do take Joel Embiid, you're definitely not going to be starting him all the time. But when you do, you're going to reap the benefits. And so that's all I'm going to say about Joel Embiid. Let's switch to rookie centers as well, because Victor Wembanyama certainly had a fantastic season. He's looking to be one of the top fantasy players, if not the top fantasy players, next year in the league. But he's not the only one. Chet Holmgren's rise is one to watch out for on a young Oklahoma City Thunder team who punched above its weight in the Western Conference this year. He actually shot better than Wemby. He had a low turnover rate, had 4th round pick draft positioning coming into the season. I think that a lot of people saw his upside but were a little concerned about his length and strength, especially coming off an injury that really made him miss the entirety of what should have been his rookie season. But he exceeded his potential by averaging 41.2 ESPN fantasy points per game and ultimately ending up as a top 30 pick. So as you can see, the hype around Wemby is definitely justified because Wemby really stepped up his game. We were a little bit worried about him and his size. He lacked the bulk needed and that frame to really be physical in today's NBA. A lot of people were saying, but he really adjusted well. But it kind of got lost, kind of, overshadowed someone who also deserves a lot of credit in that rookie class, or quote unquote rookie class, as he should be a second-year player. But that just goes to show that the league is ever evolving. I'm going to continue to say that because of the fact that big men are becoming more valued, and if you hit on them in the draft, if you really pay into them, they'll pay into the league as well. They'll really focus on improving their game, saying, what can I do to be better? And they will heighten their games to the levels that people want from them. And so, Chet Holmgren is also that guy. The last thing I want to point out is obviously off-season player movement. We've already seen a lot of trades go down. A lot of low-level ones, kind of like the Denny Avdija trade, but also high-profile ones like the Dejounte Murray and now the Paul George trade to the 76ers. And so, I feel like for the teams that either A, trade away someone, or B, move for a trade, there certainly becomes a lot of intrigue in terms of how it affects the other players on the team. Like, for example, Mikal Bridges. I'll throw him out there because he's kind of one of those high-profile trades who's not necessarily, as high-profile as a Paul George. There's not a lot of hype surrounding where he'll end up. But ending up in the Knicks is a very fascinating situation for him. Because now he adds the defensive upside, he adds the length, he adds the depth that the Knicks need. Let's move to Dejounte Murray. He does the same thing for the New Orleans Pelicans. And Paul George for the 76ers, he'll probably start right away. And that adds another power dynamic to the 76ers team that already has, a young guard in Tyrese Maxey and Joel Embiid. So, just trying to piece together how these moves will impact your choices in terms of fantasy drafts and who you take, whether or not you're overvaluing someone based off their moves or not, could really impact how you decide to build your squad. But ultimately, no matter which direction you take, I really think there is going to be a lot of volatility in who we see at the top of these rankings. Obviously, you're always going to have your Jokic's and Lukas and Embiid's of the world, but there are a lot of up-and-coming players that will prove their mettle in this league that I'm really intrigued to see in terms of fantasy. But that should just about do it for this segment. Coming up for the last segment of today's show, we will be looking at Joe Mixon as our fantasy player profile for the day. It should be a fascinating one as he's had an up-and-down career, moving to a new home in Houston. We will have to see if he will up his production. We'll be right back. to see if he can. Hello everyone and welcome back to the final segment of today's edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. And like I said before, we are going to continue throughout the week with some fantasy player profiles. I know you guys have been liking these segments. I've been loving them too, just getting to learn more and more about the players who will ultimately lead you to victory in your fantasy leagues. So without further ado, let's jump into our first one of the day, our only one of the day, in terms of Joe Mixon. Joe Mixon is a very intriguing player at the running back position because he's had high highs and low lows. But now he has a new home, a new look to the offense he brings to Houston. So hopefully there's a level of optimism surrounding him as he makes that move to the Houston Texans. But without further ado, let's jump right into what makes Joe Mixon so great. Joe Mixon, as a Cincinnati Bengal, really burst onto the scene early on in his career due to his explosivity, his ability to receive out of the backfield, and also his yards after contact. However, throughout his career, he's kind of had an interesting trajectory where we saw him really break out and other years kind of take the back seat a little bit. But I truly think that he still has value, especially now he's a Houston Texan. So without further ado, let's just jump right into his fantasy stats from his career and then his fantasy stats from last season. Over his career, he's accumulated 1,121 fantasy points. His best season was 3 years ago in 2021, where he had 245.9 fantasy points. In terms of last season, his last season as a Cincinnati Bengal, he was RB11, so right in the middle of the pack that you want to be looking at. So actually not as bad as people might think. He was 8th in snap share, 3rd in op share, one of his more up years, 7th in weighted opportunities, 5th in carries, 13th in targets. Very important if you are in a PPR league and looking for a very solid receiving running back. However, I don't think he did very much with that production. No matter his high volume of carries and targets and opportunities in this offense, he didn't do much with them. And that's why a lot of people are skeptical of him heading into the season. He was only 36th in yards per touch and 35th in yards created per touch, and an abysmal 45th in terms of breakaway run rate. So he has the volume. He certainly had the production in his last year as a Cincinnati Bengal, but he didn't do too much with it. And that certainly is a concern going into next season. However, like I said before, the silver lining is he's not a Cincinnati Bengal any longer, and he's now moving to a highly exciting offense in the Houston Texans that really is looking for that running back that can alleviate the pressure on C.J. Stroud as he moves into his second season in the NFL. And so, Joe Mixon, I really think, is going to maintain at the very least, his snap numbers, and he's going to get a high volume of touches, especially in early downs as well, just due to the fact that they want to open up the pass attack in later downs. That's their forte, the Houston Texans. So look for Joe Mixon, especially in early downs, perhaps out of the backfield in terms of screen game, to have a high volume of touches. It's what he does with them that's the question. In a Houston Texans offense that is steadily and rapidly improving, can Joe Mixon add the value we saw early in his career? Can he be the 2021 version of Joe Mixon? Or is he kind of wasted goods? Did the Houston Texans waste their time trying to find that running back, and he's not going to be any good for them? I think the former is much more likely. I think that Joe Mixon just needed some place to feel more comfortable where he can help rather than hinder. Because on the Cincinnati Bengals, I really think that they're more focused on really evolving and paying attention to Joe Burrow's ascendancy and maintaining that level of dominance at the wide receiver position, making sure that Jamar Chase and D. Higgins are locked in for quite some time. And they're not really focused on a guy like Joe Mixon. So Joe Mixon, I feel like, needed a place where he kind of feels at home and is able to go back to being himself again. And the Houston Texans offers him that perfect fit. Now, in terms of what they're projecting him to have, it's certainly not as promising as you would like Joe Mixon's numbers to be, but it certainly tells the tale of what he can be in this offense. 940 rush yards for him, they're projecting 8 TDs, 329 receiving yards and 2 TDs for a total of 194.5 fantasy points projected. And so I certainly feel like that tells the tale of balance and versatility that they believe Joe Mixon has. And I really like that for the Houston Texans because balance and versatility is the name of the game here. CJ Stroud, a lot of people would love for him to continue throwing the football deep. A lot of people would love for him to add some scrambling ability to his game. But when all is said and done, especially in your second season in the NFL where you want to maintain your success you had as a rookie, especially if you had success as a rookie, because you don't want your production to wane, you definitely need something to counterbalance everything, to balance everything out. And Joe Mixon certainly can provide that. I'm not saying he will, but based on these numbers, he certainly adds some modicum of balance that the Houston Texans are going to want. Now, the caveat is Bobby Slovic, the offensive coordinator for the Houston Texans. He, last year, certainly used CJ Stroud to a very positive effect. He got him going mainly by relying on him to elevate his receivers around him. Because of this, CJ Stroud's numbers became very inflated. He perhaps overperformed for what was expected of him. And I think that Bobby Slovic is certainly going to want to utilize the best traits that CJ Stroud can take away from the season. Because in order to sustain that level of success for Stroud, make sure he doesn't decline in progression, he's going to want to really hyper-focus on CJ Stroud getting the ball out early and often. I think the Houston Texans offense is actually going to get a lot quicker than people think. I think that CJ Stroud is going to get the ball out much quicker. I think there's going to be shorter passes implemented into the scheme. And I truly think that CJ Stroud's areas of improvement will stem from the short to intermediate areas of the field. How this will affect Joe Mixon is the question I'm asking here. Because if Joe Mixon is brought in to be a pure rusher, to simply counteract what CJ Stroud brings with his arm strength and accuracy at the QB position, how will Joe Mixon complement CJ Stroud if what I'm saying is true if the Houston Texans' tempo on offense does quicken. And so, if I'm a fantasy manager and I'm in, say, a dynasty league, I think that I would ultimately pick Joe Mixon as a flex option. However, if, say, I'm in a PPR league, I would certainly consider Joe Mixon being a starting running back. Here's why. Because of the fact that, C.J. Stroud can always rely on his receivers, I definitely think that opens the door for more screen games and thus a way for C.J. Stroud to quicken the pace and tempo of this offense. A lot of what I'm hearing surrounding the Texans really debate is the fact that they want to get going on early downs. They now see what C.J. Stroud can be, and they want to get going on early downs. So that definitely opens up the platform for the screen game to get going, and thus that is why I will leave Joe Mixon, at the very least in PPR leagues, can get going for you as a fantasy manager. So you really have to weigh your options here. Is Joe Mixon going to be a pure rusher, or is he going to be someone who adds that value out of the backfield? And that's the question you're going to have to answer. But that should just about do it for today's edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. I hope you guys like this. Like, follow, and subscribe to the shows and the networks on this podcast network. It's truly incredible what these other guys are doing as well. So don't just support me as much as I like it. But that should just about wrap it up. I've been Chris Shepard, and this has been another edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. We'll be back tomorrow with another edition, back and better than ever. Thank you guys so much for watching.